We have learned that solar systems form from giant clouds of gas and dust. Perhaps triggered by a supernova, gravity condenses the still plentiful hydrogen and helium into a star surrounded by gas and dust. Now that space dust, molecules made of heavier elements, gathers to form larger clumps of rocky material, which gravity assembles into larger and larger planetary bodies like the Earth and the other planets of our solar system. Now, some of these inner rocky planets exist at orbital distances that allow water to exist as a liquid on the surface, and this is called the habitable zone. And this is important because scientists think that chemistry is what sustains life, and that chemistry has to take place in some liquid medium, and water is good at dissolving chemicals and allowing them to interact in ways where the chemistry of life can occur. And so we have the happy circumstance that on one of these rocky planets in our solar system, life took hold. So we go from a lifeless rock to a rock with life. Well, what exactly happened? The answer is that cells happened. Cells emerged as living things on planet Earth. Now, it took a couple hundred years after the invention of microscopes to establish that living things are composed of cells. We have the early work of Hooke and Leeuwenhoek and Schleiden and Schwann, and they all contributed to what we call the cell theory. All living things are composed of cells. Cells are the basic units of life, and cells come from other cells. And so cells are the smallest things on Earth that have all those characteristics on that list, or what NASA defines life as a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Cells can meet the needs of life. So the story on our planet is that cells reproduced and then spread across the Earth, changing over time into new and more complex living organisms. And we can think about that history of life using a metaphor, the tree of life. And Mr. Darwin introduces this metaphor, and while revisions need to be made in modern times, still the idea is instructive. So the history of life is a branching tree where organisms can give rise to new kinds of organisms as they reproduce and change over time. Here we see what a tree might look like on a poster. This poster was from usefulcharts.com. And it looks like a complicated assortment of living things, but there is a structure to these organisms. At the tips of this tree, we see little pictures of different kinds of species. And these species are color-coded. So in the green we have the plants. And then down here we have fungi. And then we have the animals, are also color-coded. So we've got non-vertebrates, animals with no backbone. We've got fish in the blue, and we've got amphibians and reptiles in the yellow, and birds in the pink, and mammals in the orange. Now the tips of the trees are currently existing species. So moving down a branch is going back in time to extinct ancestors. If we go forward in time, the idea is that species can multiply from common ancestors in the past. To see how the diagram works, let's start with some birds up here. Here we've got several species of birds, and of course they're right next to each other on the tree. So we have branches that are very close together. Now if we examine the characteristics of these birds, we would see that they share lots of traits. And the way Darwin's going to understand this is that the reason why these species are so similar is because they had a recent common ancestor. So birds all share many of the features that they do because they inherited those features from a recent common ancestor. But any two species on this view have a common ancestor at some time in the past. And to find that common ancestor, we move down both branches until they meet. So let's take a whale up here, a mammal, and we'll take any particular bird over here in the bird section. And if we just follow the branch down, we'll start with the birds, the ancestor. Now we're going back in time to more and more distant ancestors, and we'll reach this point here, and that's the point of convergence of the other line of descent. So here we have the whale up here, and we go back in time down the branch, more distant ancestors, and we reach that convergence point. This would be the species, the type of creature that would be the common ancestor of a whale today and any particular bird today. And it was some kind of primitive reptile. If we were going forward in time, the idea is that primitive reptile would go on to split into multiple species. So in other words, this single species of reptile would go on to diverge into multiple species, some of which evolved through a long process into birds, and some of which evolved into mammals. Now, plants, animals, and fungi are all multi-celled organisms. So everything above this point in the diagram, all of these organisms up here are multi-celled. So animals are multi-celled. Schwann helped us understand that. Plants are multi-celled. Schleiden helped us understand that. Fungi are multi-celled. So everything pretty much in the diagram, and this is sort of a bias, we're highlighting the multi-celled organisms. These are the ones that we're familiar with, the larger types of creatures on Earth. But even any particular plant and animal would have a common ancestor. So take any particular animal, travel back down the branch, back in time, and you'll reach a point where the plant lineage also converges. So any particular animal and any particular plant has a common ancestor. It was just very far back in time. And it happens to have been a single-celled organism, which of course looked neither like a plant nor an animal. Just to emphasize that, if we think about, did humans and sunflower plants have a common ancestor? Yes, they did. Let's go to humans here. We'll travel back in time, down the branch, more distant ancestors. We come all the way down here, and we reach this point here. That would be the site of convergence. If we now go from the sunflower down the branch, and we reach this point. So the common ancestor of a human and a sunflower plant would be this single-celled organism that existed long ago. Now, these were single-celled organisms, but they were complex cells, meaning that they were large cells. They had a nucleus and other intracellular structures called mitochondria. So these were large cells here, and those single-celled organisms will give rise to the multi-celled organisms. So once these complex cells appeared, larger life forms were possible because those complex cells would get together into larger colonies to form what we call animals and fungi and plants. But there are simpler cells even, and we call them bacteria. They are the simplest and smallest cells, and they're represented in the brown down at the bottom of the diagram. Now, bacteria then were the ancestors of these complex cells that went on to do great big things, making multi-celled organisms. So we have bacteria then would be the simplest life forms, and they will somehow, we'll tell this story, somehow create more complicated single-celled organisms, which go on then to form multi-celled organisms. So all of these single-celled organisms are microscopic, but they started something really big. Right? For most of human history, prior to microscopes, nobody even knew these single-celled organisms existed. But they are a very important part of the story of life on Earth. And so we get down to the origin of life. Then, at some point in the past, chemistry produced a living cell. Now, what was that first life form like? Well, something simpler than bacteria started it all off. So we think of bacteria as the simplest kinds of cells today, so the ancestors of those simple cells would be even something simpler, yet still having the characteristics of life. And so the basic idea in modern times is that a simple cell emerged from chemistry, perhaps 4 billion years ago, and that was the key transition from a lifeless rock to a rock with life. Because if you give a simple cell 4 billion years to reproduce and change over time, modern biologists are arguing what you end up with is planet Earth today, with millions of different species. Now we can think of this idea in terms of an evolutionary inference, again attributed to Charles Darwin. When several species share a trait, Darwin considered the possibility that they inherited the shared trait from a common ancestor in the past. And you'll recall that all living things are composed of cells. So Darwin infers that the first living thing was a simple cell, perhaps assembled in a warm little pond long ago. And so then, the first living thing on Earth was simpler than a bacteria cell today. We can give this thing a name. We'll call it Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and it was some primitive kind of cell that gave rise to different kinds of bacteria, who will then go on to make more complex cells and then multi-celled organisms, and that whole evolutionary process is going to take 4 billion years. Now, why do we think the first cells were like bacteria? Well, bacteria are the smallest and simplest cells on Earth. They have no nucleus, no mitochondria. And the first cells to emerge on Earth would likely be simple cells. Bacteria show the most diverse biochemistry, as though they have been around for a long time, evolving new biochemical adaptations for a variety of environments. And bacteria can live in extreme environments, which is consistent with their ancestors evolving in extreme environments on the early Earth. You'll recall the early Earth was a very different place than it is now. And so, since today bacteria can live in extreme environments, that supports the idea that the early life forms were similar to bacteria cells. And so, because cells can reproduce with heredity, and sometimes mutations introduce new cell traits, so cells can change over time as they reproduce, the first cells could evolve into more complex life forms. Living organisms, therefore, could change over time and colonize the Earth. So the story of life on Earth is a 4 billion year story, beginning with the simplest life forms, very simple cells, and over 4 billion years evolving into the millions of species that we see today.